They were young, adventurous, and deeply in love. In the winter of 2003, Emily and Daniel set off to climb one of the most challenging peaks in the French Alps, a journey they had dreamed of for years. Both experienced mountaineers, they knew the risks. But nothing could have prepared their families or the world for what would follow. One moment, they were smiling in a photo at the summit, gear strapped tight and crampons glinting in the sun. The next, they vanished without a trace. Search teams combed the mountain for weeks, helicopters flew low over snowfields, and rescue dogs traced every scent. But no sign of the couple was ever found. It was as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. As the years went by, theories started to fade, replaced by silence and heartbreak. Some believed they fell into a crevasse hidden beneath the snow. Others thought an avalanche had buried them deep. Their families, refusing to give up hope, visited the region year after year, clinging to the faint belief that one day the Alps might give something back. 20 winters came and went. The world moved on. New climbers scaled those same peaks, unaware of the mystery lying just beneath their feet. Then the spring of 2023, a dramatic change in weather triggered a massive avalanche on the north face of the mountain. As the ice and snow tumbled down, something long hidden was suddenly exposed. Local guides, doing routine inspections after the slide, stumbled upon what they first thought were old supplies or abandoned gear. But what they found was far more. Chilling, tattered ropes still looped around a shattered ice axe. A faded scarf poked through the snow, and then partially frozen. Still locked in an embrace to human forms began to emerge from the melting ice. Word of the discovery spread fast. Authorities quickly secured the area and forensic teams were flown in. For 2 decades, the case had remained one of the Alps' most puzzling disappearances. Now, it seemed, the mountain was finally ready to tell its story. But as the ice thawed and the remains were carefully retrieved, more questions surfaced than answers. The state of the bodies, the condition of their gear, and one key item found nearby all suggested something far more complex than a simple climbing accident. Emily and Skridell had been wearing their harnesses correctly. Their equipment was top tier for the time, and there were no signs of a fall severe enough to explain the trauma found on their remains. What really happened on that mountain? Did they encounter something or someone they didn't expect? Had they possibly been forced off course, or even sabotaged? Investigators were now dealing with a mystery that reached far beyond the cold. Silence of the Alps. Family members, after years of mourning and uncertainty, were now faced with a new wave of grief and confusion. Interviews with locals began surfacing, and several veteran climbers came forward with memories of seeing the couple just days before their disappearance. Some spoke of strange weather patterns that season. Others mentioned a lone hiker spotted in the area who never came forward, despite media pleas. And then there were the photos' grainy, undeveloped frames recovered from a frost-damaged camera that had miraculously survived in Daniel's backpack. Some were personal, joyful shots of the couple. But one image in particular stood out. Taken from a distance, showed another figure in the background blurred and unrecognizable, standing far too close for coincidence. The story quickly reignited interest across social media and news outlets. How did 2 skilled climbers disappear under relatively safe conditions? Why were certain details never made public at the time? And how did their bodies, perfectly preserved for 2 decades, end up in a location that had supposedly been searched thoroughly back in 2003? As investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies started to surface in the original case files. Some pages were missing. Radio logs didn't quite match witness timelines. Was no longer just a case of a tragic climbing accident. It was starting to look like a cover dash up, and yet no official explanation was released. Not yet. DNA confirmed the identities, but the autopsy results were sealed. Still, a few key facts managed to slip through cracks. The metal crampon on Daniel's right boot had been forcibly bent backward. The camera lens had a crack that suggested it had been hit, not dropped. And then there was a handwritten journal. Entry in Emily's pocket mostly faded, but one line remained clear. "We're not alone up here." With all these layers unfolding, the mystery of Emily and Daniel's final climb now pulls us into a much bigger story, one of loss. Unanswered questions and a chilling possibility that their fate wasn't entirely in nature's hands. Was it simply the wrath of the mountain? Or was someone else there that day someone who didn't want them to return? In this video, we're going to walk you through their story from the beginning. From the moment they set foot on that mountain, to the heartbreaking discovery 2 decades later. You'll hear from experts, rescue workers, and even people who knew Emily and Daniel personally. We'll also examine the strange evidence left behind and raise the questions authorities seem reluctant to answer. So stay with us, because what happened on that mountain is more than a tragic climbing tale. It's a real-life mystery that was buried for 20 years, now rising to the surface with every melting inch of snow. And as you'll soon see, the most shocking evidence is still to come. Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks weren't just any couple. They had met 5 years before their fateful trip while volunteering with a mountain rescue organization in British Columbia. Both had a passion for the outdoors, and their love story began somewhere between snow-covered trails and midnight campfires. They shared a mutual respect for nature and an unshakable drive to explore the world's most remote places. By the time they set their sights on the French Alps in late 2002, they had already tackled peaks in Patagonia, the Rockies, and the Andes. The Alps, especially the infamous Mont Breuillard route, was supposed to be their most ambitious and most rewarding climb to date. Friends described them as careful and disciplined. Emily kept meticulous journals about every climb, and Daniel was the kind of person who double-checked ropes even when no one was watching. They weren't reckless thrill-seekers. They planned everything in detail. Flight dates, weather forecasts, backup routes, nothing was left to chance. That's why when they missed their scheduled check-in with the hotel in Chamonix, alarm bells rang almost immediately. It wasn't like them to go off-grid without a word. The initial search effort was large and swift. Helicopters flew over the region for 3 straight days. Teams of climbers scoured crevasses, ridgelines, and common avalanche paths. But the conditions were brutal. A storm had moved in shortly after they were reported missing, burying everything under meters of fresh snow. By the end of the second week, hopes began to fade. With no signs of equipment, no footprints, no distress signals, it was as if they had disappeared into thin air. The investigation continued for a few months, but when nothing new came up, it was quietly closed. Authorities chalked it up to the risks of high-altitude climbing. A tragic accident lost to the mountain, but their families never accepted that. Emily's sister Rachel kept contacting local authorities year after year, requesting that the case be reopened. Daniel's father even returned to France twice in hopes of organizing a private search. He once said in an interview, "It's not about hope anymore, it's about answers." Someone knows something. Over the years, they connected with other families who had lost loved ones in the region, building a quiet but persistent community demanding more transparency. Yet, the official line remained the same. No evidence, no foul play. Just bad luck. That all changed with the Avalanche in 2023. What made this particular slide so significant wasn't just the discovery of the bodies. It was the chain of clues uncovered with them. First, there was the position of the bodies. Emily and Daniel were found unusually close together, as if they had huddled for warmth or braced for impact. Both were fully geared, with helmets still strapped on. And yet, Parts of their equipment showed signs of damage that didn't line up with standard falls. Investigators noted that Daniel's harness had been partially cut, not frayed, cut clean, almost like a blade had gone through it. Second, there were the items found in their packs. Emily's journal was mostly destroyed by ice and time, but a few pages survived. The notes she'd written days before they vanished spoke of clear weather, smooth progress, and a strong pace. Nothing indicated trouble. But the last leg of the journey, she noted something strange. Another group seen at base early this morning. No badges, no talk, just stares. It was unclear who she was referring to, but that line stuck out to forensic linguists examining the journal. The phrasing seemed cautious, like someone sensing they were being watched. Daniel's camera, another crucial piece of the puzzle, was salvaged with great care. Most of the photos were what you'd expect: snow-covered slopes, selfies. With the peaks in the background, close-ups of their crampons, ropes, and scenic views. But the final few shots were puzzling. One photo showed a dark shape in the distance, possibly a person on a ledge that wasn't part of their planned route. Another showed what looked like an abandoned tent, half buried in snow. That, curiously, was never reported in earlier searches, and no climbing groups registered in the area. That week had claimed to set up camp there. Adding to the confusion was a weather discrepancy that surfaced after the avalanche. Satellite data from 2003 showed signs of a minor tremor or disturbance in the area, nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest a possible snow shift. But local guides who were active at the time reported feeling and hearing nothing unusual. One of them, Jean-Paul Renaud, who had participated in the original search, later said, "I always believed we missed something. The mountain didn't feel right that week, too quiet." As journalists and researchers began re-examining the case, new witnesses began coming forward. A retired lodge owner in Chamonix recalled two men who stayed briefly at her property days before Emily and Daniel vanished. "They weren't climbers," she said. "They didn't have the right gear, and they asked strange questions about routes and weather conditions. But their names weren't on any register." When she reported this detail to police in 2003, she says they dismissed it as irrelevant. But now, 2 decades later, that memory had a very different weight. The investigation, unofficially reopened by international interest, started pointing to a possible third-party encounter and interruption during Emily and Daniel's climb. But who would be up there, off route, without any record of being in the region? And why would they interfere with two experienced climbers? Speculation ran wild online. Some claimed it was a smuggling route for something illicit. Others believed it was a military or research group working off the books. A few even suggested that the couple stumbled across something they weren't meant to see, despite the growing theories. The official report remains sealed. Local authorities have yet to release a public statement explaining the exact cause of death. For now, all we have are pieces of items frozen in time, clues scattered like puzzle parts in the snow. A half-cut harness, a vague journal entry, a blurry photo, and a mystery that keeps pulling people back to that same unforgiving slope. And maybe that's the part that haunts us the most. The mountain has finally started to speak, but not clearly. It's just enough to stir our curiosity, to raise the questions we once buried. What really happened to Emily and Daniel that day? Who else was up there? And why, after all these years, does the truth still feel just out of reach? The deeper we dig, the more unsettling it gets.
Cool.
Because the more you learn about this story, the more you realize this wasn't just an accident. Something else was happening on that mountain, ... Something we're only beginning to understand. As pressure mounted to uncover the truth, a quiet investigation began forming behind the scenes. A former Alpine guide turned private investigator named Thomas Newman took a particular interest in the case after hearing about the recovered journal and photos. He had worked in the same region in the early 2000s and remembered the chatter from other climbers when Emily and Daniel first went missing. But what stuck with him now was a memory he'd long pushed aside about a restricted zone near the glacier that was cordoned off during the same week of their disappearance, supposedly for avalanche control exercises. Yet, no one he knew ever saw any activity there, and no official documentation of those exercises ever surfaced. Tomas began retracing Emily and Daniel's last known steps, carefully comparing their planned route with maps, satellite photos, and and old climber logs. What he found was subtle but strange, a narrow ledge they might have taken to avoid. Deteriorating snow conditions led directly past the area that had been off-limits, a section of the mountain, now mostly inaccessible, due. 2 ice shifts had once hosted a small Alpine shelter. It wasn't marked on most public maps anymore. And for years, rumors swirled about that place being used for something other than rest stops. Some said intelligence training. Others claimed it was a secret research post from decades prior, long abandoned but still avoided by locals. No one ever confirmed any of it. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., Emily's sister Rachel began sorting through Emily's old belongings for anything that might provide context. Among dozens of letters, old notebooks, and climbing gear, she found a single envelope marked for backup only, E. Inside was a copied itinerary, including their expected coordinates and a secondary escape route never shared publicly. That backup path overlapped Tomas's suspected deviation. The coincidence was chilling. It meant Emily had at least considered the possibility of needing a quick, unplanned retreat. But from what? Rachel reached out to Tomas with what she'd found, and the two began sharing details. Together, they pieced together a timeline that raised more questions than answers. If Emily and Daniel had shifted course intentionally, it could mean they were avoiding something or someone. If their bodies were found far off from their original route, perhaps it wasn't just a navigational error. Something forced them to change direction. And what if they had managed to document it before things spiraled? That theory led to a deeper dive into Daniel's photos. A forensic imaging expert from Zurich, analyzing the last few frames, noticed a detail missed in earlier reviews: a shadow that didn't belong. It wasn't a rock formation. It wasn't snow. It had the distinct outline of a tripod or metal pole, a device of some kind. This suggested surveillance or monitoring equipment, which made no sense for a common alpine path. Authorities were quick to dismiss it as an illusion, but to Rachel and Tomas, it felt like a door cracking open. While the primary mystery unfolded, side stories began weaving in. A retired rescue pilot, Pierre Lacoste, admitted in a quiet interview that during the original 2003 surge, his helicopter was told to avoid a certain grid section near the summit. They said it was unstable terrain, he recalled. But when I passed over it once by mistake, I saw tracks boot prints leading into the zone. The next day, it was buried in fresh snow. He had never reported it officially, fearing pushback from superiors. But now, 2 decades later, that detail felt crucial. At the same time, an investigative journalist named Leila Deschamps, known for her work uncovering environmental cover-ups in the Alps, published a short column hinting that certain regions near Mont Brulard were under private contracts for undisclosed scientific studies in the early 2000s. When pressed, she revealed she had once filed a Freedom of Information request about those studies, but parts of the documents she received were redacted. Entire paragraphs blacked out. One section mentioned civilian interference and unintended observation, dated just days after Emily and Daniel's final known check-in. The story was no longer just about 2 climbers who went missing. It was growing into something deeper, a convergence of secrecy, silence, and systemic avoidance. But there was still no solid proof. No names, no clear motive. Just fragments pointing to a truth just out of reach. Meanwhile, tension was building. Between the local authorities and the families, Rachel, frustrated by the lack of updates, began speaking to reporters, urging them to look deeper. "They say it was just an accident," she said during one interview. "But why do the facts keep telling us something else? Why is everyone so afraid of what we might find?" Her voice carried a weight that stirred public interest again. And soon, news crews returned to the Alps, hoping for a breakthrough. But not everyone welcomed the renewed attention. Tomas received anonymous messages warning him to stop digging. His car was broken into, files stolen. Rachel started noticing strange calls at odd hours, no voice, just silence. Someone, it seemed, didn't want the story to continue. And that only confirmed their suspicions. The couple had seen or heard something they were never supposed to. And they had paid the price for it. The final thread, still dangling, was the scarf. Found wrapped around Emily's remains, it bore a symbol no one could identify. It wasn't from any brand or climbing organization. Worn, faded, and partially torn, it had been tied too tightly around her wrist as if someone had secured it. Forensics couldn't explain it. But Lila believed it might be linked to a lesser-known emblem used by a private European expeditionary group known for testing equipment and conducting field research in remote, extreme climates. The group's records, sealed. All these pieces: cut harness, off-route footprints, unregistered visitors, silent threats. A coded scarf painted a story no one wanted to tell. A story of something bigger than a mountaineering tragedy. But what exactly was it? A mistaken encounter? A test gone wrong? A cover-up buried under 2 decades of snow and silence? And still, the most crucial question lingered. What did Emily and Daniel realize on that mountain? What did they document, or try to escape from that, led to their final, frozen moments? And was someone still working to make sure those answers stayed buried? The deeper the story goes, the darker it gets. And if you're still with us, know this: we're just beginning to pull on the edge of a thread that may unravel something far more than a missing persons case. Something that was never meant to be found. As the pieces of Emily and Daniel's story slowly came together, the lines between accident and intention blurred even further. Rachel and Tomas, now working closely despite their growing fears, found themselves caught in a web that felt larger than anything they had expected. What started as a personal mission for closure was shifting into something far more dangerous. They weren't just looking into a cold case. They were starting to peel back layers of something actively being hidden. They decided to return to France. Not to the same tourist-heavy slopes where Emily and Daniel were last seen, but to the surrounding valley, where whispers and half-truths still lingered among the older locals. Tomas had a contact 10X guide named Nico, who had since gone off the grid, living in a small cabin with no cell signal and barely any ties to the modern world. Nico had worked with several government-led expeditions in the early 2000s and had always been tight-lipped about it. But when Tomas showed him a photo of the scarf found on Emily's wrist, Nico froze. His hands trembled slightly, eyes locked. On the symbol, he didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he simply asked, "Where did you find this?" That symbol, Nico said, wasn't just some expedition badge. It marked a specialized Alpine operation, one that had no public record, funded by a private group conducting what he called environmental stress testing. But the testing wasn't about weather or ice. It had to do with human response under duress in higher-risk terrain. Nico hadn't been given full details, but he remembered one thing clearly. Climbers had accidentally crossed into that zone before, and they had been redirected. When Tomas asked what that meant, Nico hesitated. "Let's just say," he whispered, "they didn't come back down the same way they went up." Back in Chamonix, Richa began digging deeper into the organization. Lila had mentioned, the private European expeditionary group with sealed files. She discovered that in 2003, a temporary permit had been issued to a research team for a location, directly overlapping Emily and Daniel's intended detour. The permit had been signed, oddly enough, by a department that wasn't even related to mountaineering or geology, was linked to defense contracts. That detail sent chills down her spine. What kind of field test was taking place on an open mountain, and why were climbers like her sister not warned? As more evidence surfaced, Rachel and Tomas began receiving help from Lila and a few other journalists. One of them managed to retrieve coordinates from a preserved satellite backup file from March 2003. Those coordinates, while distorted, suggested unusual heat signatures recorded on the slope days after the couple was last seen. Heat, not from climbers or shelters but from machines, equipment, power sources that shouldn't have existed at that altitude. This brought them to the next revelation. Thermal mapping had been run over the area recently, post-avalanche, and it showed not just the remains of Emily and Daniel, but signs of metal objects buried deeper in the ice. Tomas suspected this was old equipment, perhaps left behind during whatever operation had taken place. He contacted an independent drone team to do a flyover with ground-penetrating sensors. What they found wasn't just snow and rock. There was a full structure collapsed, rusted and buried, but with enough intact parts to confirm something had been built into the mountain itself. News of this discovery was about to go public when suddenly everything shifted. The drone footage was deleted from the team's servers overnight. Rachel's backup files on her drive were corrupted. Tomas's cabin was broken into. No valuables were taken, Lee his notebook and hard drive. And Nico, the ex-guide who had spoken up, vanished. His cabin was found abandoned, dinner half-eaten. No sign of a struggle. No sign of him either. Rachel started to feel the weight of something closing in. She couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about that journal line Emily wrote. "We're not alone up here." Had her sister known? Had she seen something? The camera photo with the blurry figure, the strange camp, the sealed permit. It was all leading to something. But what? And then came the call. An anonymous voice, scrambled. And lo, left a voicemail on Rachel's burner phone. No greeting, no name. Just a chilling statement. Stop asking questions, or your sister's story ends with her. Let the mountain keep its silence. Rachel played it over and over, her hands shaking, but she wasn't backing down. She'd come too far. So had Tomas. They made a decision that night to return to the site. Not just to visit, but to go up the slope, retrace the exact route Emily and Daniel had taken. It would be dangerous. The weather was unpredictable, and parts of the trail were still unstable after the avalanche. But they knew if they didn't see it for themselves, the truth would stay buried forever. As they ascended the slope, they passed markers placed by the drone team. The higher they climbed, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just altitude. Sickness, it was the sense of being watched, as if the mountain itself remembered everything. Snow crunched underfoot, ice cracked in the wind. And the sky felt far too quiet. Near the coordinates where the hidden structure had shown up in the scan, they found something half buried, a piece of metal plating, scorched and twisted. It had faded writing in a language neither of them recognized. Nearby, a bolt sealed into the rock suggested that whatever had once stood here had been anchored tight. And that wasn't all. They found a plastic case completely frozen. Inside, a notebook, water damaged, but not beyond recovery. It wasn't Emily's handwriting. It belonged to someone else. Someone from the other camp. The entries were brief, almost coded, but one line stood out. They weren't supposed to be here. Orders unclear. Observation only. Rachel's heart pounded. They had just stepped into the center of something. Long hidden, something not meant for public eyes. And the final pages hinted at even more disturbing truths. One entry, dated the exact day Emily and Daniel vanished, ended with a single sentence, "We moved to silence." Both marked, "Ice will do the rest." The wind howled louder now, echoing off the peaks like distant voices. Rachel stood frozen in place, the notebook in hand, Thomas scanning the ridge nervously. They had found what they were looking for, but at what cost? The mountain had kept its secrets for 20 years, and now, for the first time, someone was close to uncovering everything. But someone else, maybe more than one, was still out there, watching, waiting, and they weren't going to let the truth rise without a fight. Just as Rachel and Thomas turned to descend with a frozen notebook clutched tightly in her pack, the sky shifted. Clouds rolled in fast to fast. The forecast had shown clear weather for another 24 hours, but this front came in like a curtain dropping on a stage. Thomas stopped mid-step, scanning the horizon. "This isn't natural," he muttered. Visibility dropped within minutes. Snow whipped through the air, wind rising with a force that threatened to knock them off the trail. And then came the unmistakable sound: helicopter blades. Not from above, but echoing low, hidden behind the cloud cover. But no rescue was called. No one knew they were here. That meant only one thing: someone else was watching. They ducked behind a ridge, heartbeats pounding in their ears. The chopper didn't land. It hovered in a wide arc, as if scanning. Then, just as quickly, it pulled away into the storm. Rachel turned to Thomas, her voice barely audible over the wind. That was a warning. They didn't wait to find out what came next. The descent became a frantic blur of ice and instinct. Hours later, they reached the base, exhausted, frozen, but alive. And they weren't alone. A white van sat parked by the tree line, its engine still warm. Two men leaned against it, pretending to smoke, but their eyes tracked Rachel's every move. No logos on the vehicle, no plates. Just a silent message: "We see you." That night, inside a rented chalet, Thomas defrosted the notebook page by page. Most were ruined, but two held legible text records written by someone identified only as L. The entries described multiple unplanned sightings, coded location tags, and psychological response tests under environmental stress. Then, a final page: Protocol Level 4 breach. Civilian unit confirmed visual. No contact. Action: erase trace. Thomas stared at that line in silence. Erase trace. Leahy whispered. They didn't just witness something. They became part of an experiment. Rachel leaned forward, scanning the lines over his shoulder, her throat dry. "You mean they were test subjects without even knowing it?" The silence between them said more than words could. But just as they began piecing this theory together, the second twist emerged, one they never saw coming. A call came through on Thomas's encrypted line. Unknown number. Against better judgment. He answered. The voice on the other end was female, shaky but clear. "I worked at the site, not as a scientist logistics. You don't know the full story. You think you found the worst of it? You haven't." Thomas pressed for details, but the woman continued, rushing through her words. "You're chasing evidence that doesn't exist anymore. They covered it up too well. But there's something you need to understand. Emily and Daniel weren't the only ones. There were others before them, and someone survived." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, survived?" she asked, grabbing the phone. The line crackled, then fell silent. The call had ended. Thomas checked the trace: no origin. Nothing. The voice had vanished, but what she said changed everything. If someone else had survived, why hadn't they come forward? Or had they tried and been silenced? This opened up an entirely new direction. Rachel began tracking missing climbers in the same region from prior years, looking for patterns. Most had been written off as weather-related disappearances. But 3 cases stood out: people who'd gone off route, last seen near restricted areas, whose bodies were never found. One of them, Lukas Petrov, was a Swiss national and former intelligence contractor turned extreme mountaineer. His case was quietly closed in 1998. No autopsy, no body, just a note in the official report. Assumed fatal exposure. Rachel dug deeper. Petrov's sister had gone quiet years ago. But a friend of the family recalled something strange in email Petrov sent shortly before he vanished. It was just one sentence. "They're not measuring the mountain, they're measuring us." That line echoed what was in the notebook: a system of data collection, behavior tracking. But to what end? Tomas contacted a former data scientist who once consulted for private defense contractors. When shown the journal pages and the quote from Petrov's email, the man went pale. "That's predictive behavior modeling," he said. They were tracking reactions to fear, isolation, unpredictability, but in a real-world, uncontrolled setting. That's beyond unethical. So now the picture was darker than ever. Emily and Daniel may have stumbled into the middle of a covert human experiment, unregistered, unauthorized, and covered up with silence and snow. And the worst part was, it may have been running for years before they arrived. If someone had survived, if that survivor had tried to warn the world, were they still out there? That question lingered like a shadow over everything. Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept going back to Emily's final journal entry. "We're not alone up here." What if that wasn't just about strangers or unknown climbers? What if it meant someone was already watching them, someone hiding nearby, someone who had been there the entire time? The suspense was becoming unbearable. The truth wasn't just hidden in the mountain. It was guarded, shielded by silence, and backed by something much more powerful than the weather. With every answer they found, the questions grew. With every clue uncovered, new danger followed. And yet, Rachel knew they were too deep to turn back now. The last piece was still out there, someone who knew everything. The survivor. The one who had lived through whatever nightmare Emily and Daniel had unknowingly stepped into. And as Rachel stared at the last line of the final journal page, just a simple, shaking signature from the unknown author, L, she realized something that made her skin crawl. To match the handwriting in one of the recovered photos from Daniel's roll. On the back of an image, in faint ink, were the same initials, L, whoever L was. They were closer than anyone thought. The truth came faster than either of them expected. 3 days after the anonymous call, Rachel received a package at her hotel in Geneva. No return address. Just her name, handwritten in faded ink, the same style they had seen in the notebook, signed by L. Inside the box was a flash drive, wrapped in a strip of old thermal fabric-like, something stripped from an emergency blanket. The files on the drive were encrypted, but Tomas cracked them within hours. What they found left them speechless. Videos, dozens of them, each time stamped between 2001 and 2003. Silent footage, some from static cameras buried in the ice, others handheld, grainy, and filmed under extreme conditions. Faces of climbers clearly unaware they were being recorded. Some stumbled, some argued, some sat motionless for hours, slowly deteriorating. And in one final clip, a pair of figures, one female, one male, stood hugging in the wind, backs turned to the camera. Emily and Daniel. The footage continued past that point. Blurry images of a team at least 3 people merging from the whiteout in dark, weatherproof suits. No identifying logos. One of them carried a long object, maybe a rod or a tranquilizer. The video cut to static. Then another file opened. A camera pointed at a tent interior. On the ground, Daniel, unconscious. Emily seated, crying quietly. One of the masked individuals was standing over her, speaking too softly for the mic to pick up. The clip froze, then corrupted. The rest of the files were fragments, blurred images, flashlights in the snow, frantic breathing. The final video, however, was different. It was recorded in 2021. It showed a man sitting in a dark room, hunched forward. His face was aged, his eyes sunken, but alive. He spoke directly to the camera. "If you're seeing this, it means I finally broke the chain. I'm L, my real name. Doesn't matter. I worked for them. I helped design the field setup. I didn't know what we were doing at first, just testing response patterns, behavior in extreme isolation. But it went beyond that. We were told to let things play out. We observed climbers in crisis, but when the wrong ones crossed. And when they saw the devices or questioned our presence, the orders changed. Silence them. Remove the trace." He paused, visibly shaken, then continued. "Emily and Daniel, they weren't targets. They were witnesses, but they didn't run. Emily wrote everything down. Daniel took photos. We realized too late how much they had seen. We tried to scare them off, but the storm that night wasn't ours. Nature caught up before we could. When they disappeared, they became our shield. We buried the site, but now it's melting." Rachel's hands shook as she paused the video. "He knew," she whispered. All this time, he knew what happened. But the final twist hit harder than anything before. The last segment of the recording zoomed out. Behind the man was a map, coordinates marked in red. But the camera panned slowly to a sidewall. There, barely visible in the low light, was a photograph. A recent one, of Rachel. She stepped back in disbelief. "That's not possible." Tomas stared, mouth dry. "They've been watching you. This whole time." It all came crashing in. The strange men near the van. The deleted drone footage. The corrupted files. The call. They had never been one step ahead. They'd been allowed to chase the truth. Until now, Tomas grabbed his laptop, quickly copying everything onto a protected external drive. "We need to release this. All of it. Now." They worked through the night, uploading the data to a secured cloud. Tomas sent backup links to trusted journalists. Rachel contacted Lila. Everyone needed to see what had been hidden for so long. But as the uploads reached 97%, the screen flickered, then went black. "No, no, no," Tomas whispered, scrambling to reboot. A message appeared in red. On the screen, "You were warned." They bolted from the chalet, hard drive in hand, racing to the car. But parked behind theirs was a black SUV with tinted windows, engine running. Rachel didn't hesitate. She shouted, "Drive, now." Tomas hit the gas. The tires screeched on the ice as they sped down the narrow mountain road, heartbeats racing, faster than the wheels. The SUV followed at a distance, never too close, but never disappearing either. Like a shadow, the uploads were lost, but one copy remained. That small external drive. The last piece of the story. They reached the border by sunrise, exhausted but alive. Weeks later, the footage began surfacing slowly. Anonymously, through encrypted links shared by journalists who didn't flinch at threats. The world watched in horror as the truth unraveled. Not just about Emily and Daniel, but about an entire covert operation buried beneath 2 decades of snow. Sealed by silence, Emily and Daniel were finally laid to rest. Their story no longer a mystery, but a warning. And yet, even in the aftermath, one question still lingered. One last image burned into Rachel's mind. In the very first clip from the flash drive, barely visible in the corner, was another face. Not a scientist, not a hiker, a woman, wrapped in thermal gear, watching the camera, eyes focused, still. Rachel froze the frame. Her breath caught. It was Emily. But the timestamp read for months after the day she was declared dead. Rachel stared at the frozen image for what felt like forever. Emily's face, partially obscured by a frost-covered hood, looked straight into the lens. There was no fear in her eyes, no confusion, just calm awareness. That time stopped 4 months. After her disappearance changed everything they thought they knew. If it was real, if it hadn't been manipulated, then Emily hadn't died in that storm. She'd survived, and she had been with them, maybe even part of them. The footage didn't explain how. There was no follow-up clip, no sound, no context. Just one frame in one corrupted file, buried inside a drive that had almost never seen daylight. But in that frame, Rachel saw something even deeper than answers. She saw intent. Her sister hadn't just witnessed something. She had understood something. And whatever she had chosen to do in those final months wasn't out of fear. It was out of purpose. Tomas and Rachel spent the next few weeks retracing every clue with this new angle. They connected Emily's old journal entries with what the flash drive revealed. A few pieces started to click. The line, "We're not alone up here," wasn't just a warning, it was a signal. A sign that Emily had figured it out. That she knew she and Daniel had wandered into something engineered, something hidden. And instead of running, they documented everything they could. Her notes, his photos. Even their altered route. The unanswered question remained what happened. To Emily after that moment, was she taken? Was she turned? Or did she make a deal to protect the truth, perhaps to spare someone else? There were no more videos of her, no further sightings. Her body had been found with Daniel's, frozen together in what seemed like a tragic ending. But now Rachel wondered, had Emily returned to that spot? Had she chosen it? The operation was about control and behavior. Perhaps the one thing the organization couldn't account for was a person willingly becoming part of the mystery. That thought haunted her. Still, even without every piece, Rachel and Tomas had enough to bring the truth forward. The story, backed by the recovered footage and notebook, was released through independent investigative outlets and trusted journalists. Major platforms were hesitant at first, nervous about the implications, but public demand grew quickly. Hashtags like #Alpine experiment, #Emily and Daniel, and #Glacier cover-up began trending across social media. More climbers came forward. A few remembered strange encounters, areas they were told to avoid, or sightings of strange equipment tucked behind snowbanks. Patterns emerged. Eventually, a quiet inquiry was opened by a European Oversight Committee. Nothing was confirmed outright, but several key contracts related to environmental testing in the Alps were quietly terminated. The unnamed private organization behind the operation went silent. Their online presence vanished. No interviews, no denials, just absence. Like snow smoothing over footprints. Rachel declined all major media interviews. She didn't want the spotlight. She only wanted her sister's story to be told the way Emily would have wanted. Truthful, detailed, and human. She published a book instead, The Mountain Remembers, co-authored with Tomas, told the full story from start to finish. It wasn't just a mystery or conspiracy. It was a personal account of loss, love, and resilience. A tribute to two climbers who unknowingly uncovered something far bigger than themselves. And to the sister who refused to let their truth stay buried in the final chapter. Rachel wrote, "Some say mountains are just rock and snow. But the Alps reminded me they're more than that. They hold memory. And sometimes, when the world forgets, the mountain remembers for us." As months passed, the Avalanche site was quietly closed off. A small memorial stone was placed near where Emily and Daniel had been found. Not a grave, just a marker. On it was carved one line from Emily's journal. "We kept walking because someone had to see what was hidden." Tomas went back to guiding. he never spoke publicly again about the case. But those who hired him often said he had a certain look in his eyes when on snow-covered slopes, like he was always watching, always remembering. Lila, the journalist, who first hinted at the sealed documents, became a leading voice for outdoor rights and transparency in extreme research zones. She pushed for new policies that would require full public disclosure of all field-based studies conducted near civilian areas. Her work helped build a new law in the EU regarding open-access terrain usage and public mapping transparency. Her quiet persistence became a legacy of its own. And Rachel, she left the mountains for a while, moved to the coast. But every year, on the same week her sister disappeared, she returned to the base of that climb. Not to mourn, but to breathe the same air, stand where Emily once stood, and leave a note, just a single line, folded and tucked into a crevice behind the memorial. 1 year, her note read, "I saw you in that frame. You weren't lost, you were still climbing." And maybe that's the final twist no one expected. It's not the cover-up, or the hidden experiments, or the last-minute survival theory, but the possibility that Emily had never been a victim, not fully. That in those final months she became something else. A witness, yes, but also a guardian of a truth too heavy to carry and too dangerous to expose all at once. Maybe that's why she returned to Daniel. Why they were found together. Maybe that was her choice. In the end, the Alps gave back more than they took. They revealed a story that wasn't just about mystery, but about memory. About what we leave behind and who is brave enough to go looking when everyone else has stopped. Emily and Daniel's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. A reminder that the world's most remote places often hold the clearest reflections of what humanity is capable of, both the worst and the best. And so, as the snow continues to fall each winter, covering what was once exposed, the mountain holds quiet again. Not with secrets, but with truth layered in ice, carried in wind, and finally heard.